Well, Kamala Harris has certainly put the Democrats back in contention in the relatively short time since Joe Biden agreed not to recontest the US election. But in that time, the Vice President, and now presidential candidate, has also seen her gender, her race, her sexuality, all become, well, fair game for critics and targeted online campaigns. Much of this content is based on misinformation and disinformation, and sadly, this sort of stuff has become, well, quite unsurprising, but it's no less alarming given how quickly it can spread and how easily some of it is, well, accepted as fact by some. Nor is this a problem confined to presidential candidates. With the US election now just over 60 days away and our own Australian election due in the next 6 or 7 months, how is misinformation and disinformation being weaponised, and how is it potentially undermining democracy? One of the world's leading experts is in Canberra this week, and I'm keen to get a better sense of what's happening online and what is and should be done about it. I'm David Speers on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Well, Nina Jankowicz is a former executive director of the US Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board. She is the co-founder and CEO of American Sunlight Project, a bipartisan group that aims to increase the cost of lies that undermine democracy. Nina has also advised governments, international organisations and tech companies and testified before the US Congress, the British Parliament and European Parliament. Nina, welcome. Good to have you here in Canberra.
Thanks for having me, David.
So I thought it might be worth starting with some examples, recent examples of what we're talking about here, because often it's very clear what's true and what's false, but much is in the grey zone where we're trying to interpret what's problematic. What are some recent examples you would point to of the sort of thing you're concerned about?
Yeah, well, we've got all over the gamut in the U.S. election cycle right now. We've got AI-generated or AI-enhanced disinformation, which is really worrying me. So one example of that, unfortunately, was shared by Elon Musk, the owner of X, formerly Twitter, when he shared a deepfake audio of a Kamala Harris campaign ad and shared it as if it were truth. Of course, X didn't moderate that content, which was quite ironic, even though they have a policy against election deepfakes and impersonation on the site.
This was the one where Kamala Harris is saying that she's the diversity hire. Is that the one?
Yeah, and that she's incompetent and unintelligent and basically unfit for the office of the presidency. And it's really difficult to the kind of naked ear to tell if that's really her or not. And I think, most people probably recognize that that was a joke. But we're at the point where it's just indistinguishable for normal people. And we have here the world's probably richest and largest Twitter account sharing that information, which is being pumped into users' feeds all over the world. And then we've got foreign actors doing it as well. Really recently, the Department of Justice released a report about how AI-enabled Russian bot accounts have been sharing disinformation that is anti-Ukraine, that is anti-Democrat, that is aimed to sow discord in the American electorate before the election. So that's just two examples, pretty, opposite ends of the spectrum, perhaps less impactful and somewhat more impactful and more worrisome. And then we've got a lot in between for people who are sharing false or misleading information for power or for profit. That's the definition of disinformation.
And the source of this, you mentioned the Russian bots. We know the Russians have been pushing misinformation and disinformation to sow discord and so on. We saw that in the 2016 presidential election in the US. Is it still the Russians are the main source, or is it now a wider spectrum of sources?
So we know for sure that Russia, China, and Iran are all active in this election cycle and have been active in every election, every national election since 2016. There are also smaller nations, perhaps less powerful nations with fewer resources, who are trying their hand at spreading disinformation because there's really no point not to. It's not a huge cost, and the return could be very big. And the playbook is open for everyone to see now that the Russians have been doing it. It's interesting, you asked this comparative question, who is doing it more? That's really difficult to tell. And that is because we're in this environment right now around the world where the social media platforms have cut off access to data that allows analysts like me and journalists like you to track what's going on the social media platforms.
Did they used to provide that?
Yes.
Right.
So it used to be much more open. Then Cambridge Analytica happened and Facebook went into this sort of, I would say, restricted environment with information, but you could still get your access access to it through a platform called CrowdTangle. Now, just a few months before the election, they've shut down that social listening tool. Elon Musk very famously has monetized access to data on X, so you have to pay about $40,000 a month to get access just to the main feed in order to do kind of big data analytics on that. And then TikTok and Snapchat and many of the other platforms have never provided access to begin with. And so we're left in the dark, which I think is really concerning in this year of elections, as it has been, much talked about. So many people voting, billions of people across the planet, and yet we have less data access than ever.
So the tech giants know the source of this stuff, but we can't find out.
That's exactly right. Unless there is, government disclosures, we're seeing a lot less voluntary disclosure from the tech platforms, which was never, I would say, never enough to begin with. It's always been journalists, whistleblowers, and researchers who have been finding the big stories here and raising the alarm about some of the harms that are ongoing online.
So a lot of this, you mentioned the Kamala Harris example. Is it only targeted at Democrats, or is it both sides? Does any of this misinformation or disinformation target Donald Trump?
Well, I think China is famously agnostic when it comes to the U.S. candidate. And in fact, in 2020, decided not to interfere at all because a Biden presidency or a Trump presidency would be equally bad for China. But we've seen Iran, for instance, target Donald Trump really recently through a hack and leak operation. Iran was able to gain access to Trump's campaign through an affiliate who didn't have good security protocols and was able to phish the campaign and get information that then was actually not released by the media in the United States. And I think that's an interesting point because, of course, in 2016, when Russia gained access to the Clinton campaign, those emails were bandied about everywhere. The media has become a little bit more circumspect, but certainly Iran has been targeting the Trump campaign this time. We know for a fact.
You mentioned Kamala Harris and that AI fake image of her or video of her. Generally, what she has copped goes beyond that too. Yeah. There is quite sexualized content as well, and some of it has even been shared by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Is what Kamala Harris is facing on that front worse than what Hillary Clinton copped back in 2016?
Well, I don't have the data on Clinton, but I can say for a fact that women who represent intersectional identities, who are women and Black or South Asian, as Harris is all three, or women who are gay, for instance, receive worse and more abuse online than their white cisgender counterparts. I did a study in 2020 that looked at 13 candidates for office who were running in that election over 2 months on 6 social media platforms. And we identified 336,000 pieces of sexualized abuse or disinformation targeted at those 13 women, and 78% of that was targeted at Kamala Harris. And so on July 21st, the moment that President Biden announced that he wouldn't seek re-election and endorsed Kamala Harris, I immediately shared a thread about the conclusions from that study because I wanted people to be able to identify those narratives when they came back. And like clockwork, they came back pretty much immediately. All of these same regurgitated narratives that Kamala allegedly slept her way to the top, that she wasn't Black enough or South Asian enough to claim those heritages, which, of course, we've heard President Trump say. And one very peculiar one, although it is something that a lot of women in power are targeted with, they allege that she is secretly transgender, that she couldn't have made her way to the top if she weren't secretly a man. And, these are things, again, that we've tracked for years that have targeted Harris for years. And the fact that we're seeing, major political candidates and former presidents share them openly shows just how normalized this rhetoric has become in American politics. And it's something that really disturbs me.
Is this about keeping women out of public life? Is that what what's behind
absolutely.
all this?
It is a purposeful attempt to not only denigrate Harris and say she's not fit for the job, we're not ready for a woman president, but it's also a signal to other women who not only want to seek public office, but those who might want to participate in public life, participate in their democracies, saying, if you speak up, if you have the temerity to raise your voice, this is what might happen to you as well.
You wrote a book about this, in fact, How to Be a Woman Online, How to Deal with Harassment, Abuse, Doxing, Disinformation in Online Spaces. What should be done when this happens?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that, again, here's a place where the platforms are really dropping the ball and they are not upholding their duty of care for women on the internet. On Twitter, at least a couple of years ago, men's tweets were retweeted twice as often as women's. On Reddit, 73% of users are men. I don't think either of those things are, they're not just random statistics. Women are engaging less in those spaces because it is so toxic there. And I can tell you from what I've experienced and what I've researched and the focus groups that I've run that especially younger women are self-selecting out of speaking publicly online because they don't want to engage. And so the first thing I would say is the platforms need to really enforce their terms of service. It is not okay and it is not allowed on Facebook, on Twitter, and most other platforms to harass someone on the basis of their gender or sex. And they are not, I can tell you for a fact, they are not enforcing those terms of service. I've reported rape threats. I've reported instances where my U.S. government portrait was made to look like I was a corpse and I had a nail through my head, and I was told that those weren't violent threats. And those pieces of content stayed up. Those are just two examples, but I've interviewed hundreds of women who have experienced similar things.
And I want to come back to those tech companies and perhaps what governments can do about that. But just for the Australian audience, just remind us of your experience a couple of years ago. What happened?
Yeah, so I had been a disinformation researcher for a number of years. I was working at the nonpartisan Wilson Center, which advises Congress and the U.S. government on a number of issues. I was dealing with disinformation, and I had been, I know this is a little bit of backstory, but I had been a witness for folks like Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa in Congress, as well as Democrats, right? I was sought after by both parties to give my advice on this issue. And so the Biden administration, when they were attempting to set up a policy coordination body within the Department of Homeland Security to deal with disinformation issues, they called on me because I had done work in policy coordination and studied how other governments had done this. And I had never really seen myself at DHS. I thought, here's a chance to serve my country. I had thought perhaps I'd be, at the NSC or the State Department or something like that. But it seemed like a chance to make an impact and help. And so I said, yes, of course. And I was brought in March 2022. I advised the department that I thought they should very urgently announce an effort like the Disinformation Governance Board, which has a big, scary sounding name, but is actually pretty anodyne and meant to bring different parts of DHS, which for Australian listeners is one of the largest U.S. government agencies that has a lot of disparate parts. Like we've got our emergency management folks and our Transportation Security Authority and our cyber and infrastructure folks, as well as Customs and Border Protection.
Sounds a bit like our Department of Home Affairs.
A little bit, right? Yeah. A myriad kind of efforts all in one entity. And it was to bring them together and make sure that they were talking to each other. And critically, in responding to disinformation, make sure that we had guardrails on that protected civil rights, privacy, and civil liberties. And when this effort was announced, in my opinion, far too late and too opaquely by the department, the right wing and some on the far left said that it was going to be a ministry of truth and that I was going to have the power to censor people. This was unequivocally false. But that narrative gained a lot of traction, including on Fox News. And within days, I was receiving death threats. My family and I were doxxed. My personal life was just kind of turned over for the world to see because it was filling a vacuum of information that the department wasn't providing. And that went on for about 3 weeks until the department decided that they were going to do a review of the Disinformation Governance Board, essentially caving in to these attacks, which were baseless again. And at the time, I was just a few weeks away from becoming a mother. And I decided that it wasn't worth my family's safety at that critical and really vulnerable time in my life to stick it out because it didn't seem like the administration was going to really dig in and support the effort. And I think that was a critical mistake because now what we have in the United States is a really empowered class of quote-unquote free speech warriors who categorize any counter-disinformation effort, either from the government or civil society as censorship.
That's a horrible experience for a few weeks, and you had to go. Has anyone filled that role, or you mentioned there they decided to review it?
Yeah, they decided that the board wasn't necessary.
So it's gone.
It's gone, which I think is a huge problem for national security in the United States because, again, that coordinating role was something that nobody was really doing within DHS or elsewhere. And other efforts within the government have been under fire since then.
So that brings us to Australia. We have an ESafety Commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant. It's a little bit different, but basically is there to look at extremist content on social media platforms. Julie Inman-Grant recently went through a somewhat similar experience with enormous abuse, doxing, targeting her family as well, after she took on Elon Musk over terrorist content on X. Elon Musk called her a censorship commissar, and that was spread very widely. What did you make of that episode here in Australia?
Yeah, I've actually got a paper coming out this week that looks at Julie's experience as a case study of what is a broader phenomenon of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And I think Julie's unfortunate experience encapsulates that you can be a woman in a very powerful position in a democratic country like Australia who is just doing her job, just enforcing the laws that Australians have voted on and your representatives have passed, right? And you can still come under enormous fire. So we looked at a subset of the over 80,000 posts that Julie received in the first 24-hour period after Elon Musk started targeting and tweeting about her. In that subset of posts, 83% of what she received was either negative or threatening. And
83%.
83%. I mean, even if you have an extremely thick skin, which I know Julie does, she is a crusader. That is a lot. It is a lot for any one person to handle. And I will say that most of it was gendered, calling her things like Karen or Big Mother, looking at her appearance, denigrating that. Transphobic narratives, again, targeted Julie as well as targeting her family, which should be off limits for anybody, even if you vehemently disagree with them. And I should also add that, again, Julie was completely within her portfolio in responding to what was terrorist content on Twitter and what would have likely been, under any other circumstances, taken off. But Elon Musk kind of dug in and said that, he didn't like Julie's transparency powers, which she had used to kind of call him out on some things that he hadn't upheld, including CSAM, child sexual abuse material on the platform. He had very famously said, I'm going to get rid of this stuff. Her transparency powers have shown that that's not the case, and he didn't like being called out that way. And so he used this as a political issue to then push back against her. And I just think, again, it shows the unelected power that these tech executives have.
I was going to ask you that. I mean, how much power does Elon Musk have, and how does he wield it?
I mean, he has incredible power because this is, even though Twitter has taken a hit since he became its owner, it's still a place where politicians, journalists, and normal people interact about the news of the day.
More than other platforms.
That's, again, it's hard to say because we don't have the data, but it's still a place where conversation happens. And it is still certainly a place where networked harassment can happen. And I think one thing I'd like to underline for everyone is that this isn't just about mean words online, right? In Julie's case, in my case, and in the case of many others, including Kamala Harris, there was recently a man who was arrested and charged because he was credibly threatening the vice president as well as many other U.S. officials. This has a real life effect. The internet and our everyday offline lives, there's no wall between them. And we're seeing increasingly that people are radicalized to violence. So Musk has a huge, huge megaphone. He knows it. And now that he owns this platform, there's no moderating of his content.
So what can be done about all of this, just on the structure we have here in Australia with the ESafety Commissioner? Is that the right structure?
I actually really admire the ESafety Act, the Online Safety Act that governs the work that the Safety Commissioner does. I think it really balances freedom of expression with safety in a very unique way. So I'm sure your listeners are very informed and know how it works. But essentially, those transparency powers that I mentioned before give Julie and her team a really unique way to say, OK, we think something might be going on these platforms. Here's what Australian law says about what the duty of care is for the platform. platforms, what are you doing, platforms, to respond to this? And they respond. And if she finds that, she has data that shows that they're lying or they don't respond to their fullest ability, then she can fine them. And I also really like that there is kind of rectification for anybody who is receiving targeted harassment, non-consensual intimate image sharing, or cyberbullying against children. They have somewhere to go, which in our U.S. system, because of we're federated, we have a lot of different states' governments and states' laws to navigate. We don't have federal laws about things like deepfake pornography, for instance. And so I think it's nice that the Australian people have a champion in Julie.
And we've just passed laws on
deepfake
sharing
porn,
of deepfake pornography, but the government is still looking at laws on misinformation and disinformation.
Yes, and
that's not something the ESafety Commissioner necessarily polices. Is it possible to legislate, to pass laws on misinformation and disinformation?
It's really tricky. And I have looked at the act that was introduced last year and think that from my American sensibilities, it goes a little bit too far, as I understand
in curbing
it.
Free speech?
Yes,
right.
Yeah. It would empower your media commission to look at instances of mis and disinformation on the platforms and label them. And that's not something that I am comfortable with. I like the way that it would introduce oversight and transparency for the social media platforms. And in a similar way to what ESafety does, be able to ask the platforms what you're doing to deal with this stuff. But I think individually, it has to be up to the platforms to identify and label that
You don't
content.
think there should be, ACMA, which is the media authority here, calling out that tweet or that post is misinformation? That would be problematic.
I think it gets to a difficult position, because if you have a government that comes in that, let's say, goes a little bit to one side of the spectrum or the other, you then have an empowered media commission that can make those decisions politically. And we've seen something like that happen in a number of different countries. And it's not something that I would encourage, but I do think those oversight and transparency powers are really important. The other thing that's problematic with the ACMA kind of the way it's situated now in the law, and I understand the law is now being kind of amended based on the comment period that went on, is that there's a lot of time that passes before ACMA says to the platforms, can you send us the information that you have about this content? And then ACMA makes a judgment. And by that time, the content, yes, exactly. Right. So I think it's a really difficult issue. And instead, what we need is, something that encourages the platforms to act in the interests of democracy rather than in the interests of the companies that they are, the profit-making engines that they are.
Is that wishful thinking that these platforms would act in the interests of democracy? Are they doing that?
Well, I always like to liken it to airplanes, right? If you have an airplane, Boeing, a very recent example, right, that is having many problems, you start an inquiry and you see what's going on in that company because it's affecting the safety of your population. And I think you can make an argument that social media is affecting the safety of populations. Yes, affecting democracy as well, but public health and public safety first and foremost. And those profit-making engines need to be regulated. And, it's still pretty early in the internet era. We're 30-ish years in, 30 years into the making of the car or the plane. I don't think we had as many regulations around it, but it's time for us to start thinking about the ways that we can do that and still preserve free speech and make sure that, people aren't being doxxed and threatened just for using that right to free speech.
So are we on the right track, and are we doing enough with the approaches here in Australia, the ESafety Commissioner, this misinformation, disinformation law still being worked through? Are these the sort of things, or is there something you think we really need to do?
No, I think the Australian government is on the right track. I've had a lot of conversations this week where I feel like Australian MPs and folks in politics want to do more, and that's lovely because we don't even talk about it in the States, and I know the grass is always greener, right? But I do think the approach that you're taking the clear-eyed recognition of the threat, and the fact that I think from the polling that I've seen, most Australians do recognize that this is a problem. It means that you're going in the right direction. You've also got the ABC here, which is a highly trusted brand, and
exactly.
Public media is really important. It's part of the solution.
Are we better protected from the problems of misinformation and disinformation here in Australia than in the United States right now?
I think a lot of countries are better protected than in the United States right now, and that's because of the normalization of mis and disinformation in our political environment.
So just finally, how worried are you about what's going to happen in the next 60 and a bit days before the US election?
Well, I'm strapping in from when I land next week in back home to November 5th, I believe our election is. It's going to be a wild ride, and we've already seen political violence in the form of the assassination attempt. We've seen major, foreign incursions or attempted incursions into the political and information environment. So I think that's just the tip of the iceberg, and we'll probably be finding out about more and more of it even after the election. So, I don't want to be a pessimist. I still think American democracy is resilient. And part of the reason that, I started a new nonprofit to look at these things is because I think we can push back on them and get the country back on the right track. And hopefully that'll have some lessons observed for the rest of the world as they continue their elections, including yours next year.
Well, indeed. It's coming around the corner very fast. Nina Jankowicz, really good to talk to you. It's such interesting and important work that you do. Good luck with the rest of your trip here in Australia. Thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
And if you have any thoughts on this conversation, any ideas for the podcast, do drop us a line, insiders@abc.net.au. We'll see you Sunday morning. Bye for now.